Dr. Joseph Bobadilla is a professor of surgery right here at University of Kentucky, and he serves as the organization's Associate Chief Medical Information Officer, and he will lead our panel discussion today. Dr. Bobadilla.
All right, thank you very much. Definitely my disclosures are I am not an endocrine surgeon, so I'm a little bit out of my realm here, and I also didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night because I'm local, so I'll do my best to convey some information to the group. But thankfully we do have some wonderful panelists here that know a little bit more about the day-ins and day-outs of endocrine surgery for you all. Our first panelist is a practicing endocrine surgeon and associate professor at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. She also runs their portfolio of innovation programs, things like Shark Tank, prototyping grants, residency innovation, and medical student biodesign programs. She works for Intuitive Surgical and is on the advisory board for Doximity AI as well, and has research interests in areas of self-service automation tools for economic modeling, manuscript review, data extraction of real-world assets. Please welcome Dr. Phoebe Zhang. Our second panelist is an associate professor in the Department of Surgery at Mount Sinai. She also holds a secondary appointment in the Department of Artificial Intelligence and Human Health. She has NIH-funded research focusing on the application of multimodal machine learning and AI to improve thyroid cancer diagnosis and recurrence of predictions. She also serves as the co-director of their Surgical Intelligence Program. Please welcome Dr. Denise Lee. Our third panelist today is an assistant professor in foregut surgery, as well as computer and information science at the University of Pennsylvania. He has a secondary appointment in general robotics, automation, sensing, and perception, the GRASP program, and also is a lead of the Penn Computer Assisted Surgical and Outcomes Laboratory, PICASSO, and a multidisciplinary research group that is both the medical and engineering schools. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Hashimoto. Our final panelist unfortunately could not get here due to some travel difficulties, but we will carry on, and our thoughts are with him in these difficult times. Our charge today was twofold from the program committee. First of all, they wanted us to evaluate and explore the applications of AI as it has its role in endocrine surgery, specifically looking at the role of improving diagnostics, accuracy, guiding operative planning, and enhancing patient safety. Secondly, they also wanted us to touch on current innovations, implementation, and challenges, as well as the future directions, provided a roadmap for the integration into practice for our attendees. So today's session is going to be mostly an open panel discussion. It's going to rely heavily on audience participation. There's obviously microphones throughout the room. For those in the audience to step up, please state your name and your institution and pose your question to the panel. We'll start with some pre-scripted questions that were sent in ahead of time, but we will be open at any time for any audience participation. So please feel free to step up and get in line for those questions. The first question that we have for the panel today is, how are you currently utilizing AI in your practice? What have you found that it is helpful in facilitating? And what have been some of the barriers or the detractors to the use of the technology?
All right, I will get us started. So I use AI in a couple of different aspects, both on my Baylor job and also on my Intuitive job. So I was a relatively early adopter of AI scribing, so I probably tried my first product in 2017, and it was actually pretty terrible. So I went back to templates, and it hasn't been until very recently that we have I've gone back to some AI scribing. So the product that I currently use, and I have a full disclosure here, is Doximity Scribe. And my enterprise has not purchased an integrated product with the EHR, but will be signing a contract with has signed a contract with a bridge, so that I'll be going back and trying out a bridge and seeing if it's better. So AI scribing is one. I will say that there's been an amazing evolution of how good the technology is. Like now the technology can take into context. It used to be very transcriptional, I would say, and now it's much more improved. So like if you're just chatting with your patient about something like their vacation or how their family is doing, it automatically will take that out of the note if it's not relevant to the discussion you're having about the clinical problem. So it has just improved leaps and bounds. The other place that I use it a lot is in the large language models, which I'm sure at least like 50% of this room is already using. I like to use at least 3 different chat bots, depending on the clinical question, depending on how sensitive it is, and whether I'm using a enterprise-approved product, or whether I'm using it for personal use, whether it's a clinical question or a non-clinical question. And sometimes I like to put the same question in multiple chat bots just to test them against each other. So that's the Baylor side. And then on the intuitive side, we do a lot of natural language processing. My group does health economics and outcomes research, and so we have these massive data sets that we're trying to pull very specific unstructured variables out of. So we spend a lot of time creating algorithms to pull those out.
So to echo what Phoebe was saying, I think that in my own clinical practice, the most practical tools I've been using have been ones that have been enterprise approved already. So they really facilitate at Mount Sinai the introduction of using the Microsoft Dragon Copilot. And I had trialed that out and looked at it actually about 2 to 3 years ago. And like Phoebe was saying, it was kind of underperforming at that time. It didn't describe things very well. It didn't kind of capture the conversation with the patients as accurately. And so that was a bit abandoned by our Department of Surgery at the time. But now at this point, in this past year, at the sort of enterprise institutional level, it's been introduced as a product that's more rapidly available for physicians and is being rolled out. And they've really facilitated making it easy for us to adopt it and use it in practice, where we have a lot of people who come and support us and then help us to integrate it into the notes and practice using it. So I would say regarding that type of tool, I use it because it's practical and it's easy for me. That's kind of the everyday. I think there's also the idea of like what's more aspirational AI and how I've been thinking about how to use AI for just more personal use and also for performing specific kind of more domain tasks. I use it for a lot of my administrative efforts. So I use Claude Cowork a lot because they have these agentic capabilities that have really helped to accelerate a lot of like administrative responsibilities. It's something that I recommend trying to use, if you all can kind of play around with it. The AI agents and the idea of them is that they are able to perform and execute multiple tasks more independently in multi-step fashion. And I think that that's a great advantage to over just the general kind of LLMs, chatbots that we typically use that are more informative. And although the latest models have really advanced in terms of their reasoning, and they can perform and do great things like give you great images and things like that, the idea of AI agents, and if you're able to integrate this into your own kind of clinical workflow or administrative workflow, are really exceptional in terms of being able to take some information that you provided in a folder and then perform things like make agendas for you, come up with new ideas for like research projects, help to organize things that would have otherwise taken me at least several hours.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's very similar. Despite what happens on the research side of my part of the job, I am largely actually a skeptic in clinical implementation, as you may have gotten from the last hour. I do use ambient technologies. We have DAX Copilot as part of our sort of institutional build. I use it for some patients and not for others. For example, for forget cases, when patients are describing dysphagia, it tends to write food impaction. It's like patient experiences food impaction 3 times a day. That is not accurate, right, medically. So I have found that I've had to change the way I use them and the types of patients that I will use them for. That being said, where I've found the most value is in writing insurance appeal letters, using LLMs because I can feed in the policy from the insurance company and basically have the LLM say, here is what you need to put in the letter. Let me draft your first draft. We do have some institutional access to ChatGPT that allows us to put in HIPAA information, and so we can use that. I haven't found it to be the best for those types of things, so I will often do it on a separate account without putting in any specific patient information, but then sort of fill in the blanks with our institutional account. And that's actually where I probably found it to be the most valuable from a clinical standpoint. They're using an AI on us, might as well use it on them. From a research perspective, I use it a lot. As you can imagine, not just from the perspective of like we build models in the lab, but actually to organize information. So when students come into the lab, we use Notebook LM to help them create concept maps of the literature to better understand where their project may fit in the larger scope of what it is that they're investigating. We have specific sort of agentic systems around doing certain tasks in the lab, to your point, Dr. Lee. We also use it very much to help with grant writing. Very similar to insurance appeals, there are, of course, all of the minutiae about make sure you include X, Y, Z, or what have you in this grant. The NSF in particular gets very specific about these things, and they hide them. And while our grant administrators are very good at helping us flag certain things, there are ways in which these large language models can help you take the concepts of what you've already written into the grant and then reformulate them to meet the different criteria that different grants may require. So certainly it's helped from that perspective as well.
Yeah, excellent, interesting. So, interesting point. I think all three of you in your response ultimately kind of touched on, when enterprise approved, and you certainly use the AI more in your non-clinical, it sounds like, daily use case than your clinical. Someone now who has enough gray hair to have an O after my name or initials in one of my roles. How do you see the enterprise adoption? Is the rate too slow, too fast, just right? What would you like to see for those in the executive suites on their adoption curve for these AI technologies?
I think you probably can answer this question the best because I think the way that we evaluate these tools has also changed over time. I think when the first generation of tools came out, it was just like, is this disruptive to your workflow? Do physicians like it, right? And now we're in the era where if you want to sell a digital product to an enterprise, you have to show hard return on ROI, right? Like you have to be able to show that this is actually going to generate the hospital more money because it is actually going to improve someone's efficiency where they're going to be able to see more patients. You have to have some sort of objective data about reducing burnout, right? Like you have to be able to document like this group of physicians is actually having less pajama time documenting at home, right? Like you need real hard ROI metrics now, and that's very different than when people were coming out with these products 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that ROI is definitely something that gets the ear of those, and it's oftentimes difficult to prove. To your talk earlier, right? A very small, you might even say incrementally non-significant 15-minute gain leads to a 70% improvement in quality of life. How do you quantify that? That certainly is an interesting topic. I see we have our first podium request here in the center aisle.
Yes, it's, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Barry Nabnett, University of Kentucky. Might as well just kick this off. I have two questions. The first is around the de-skilling concept, and the second is around governance. So with regards to de-skilling, I mean, studies have shown that in adolescents that are heavy social media users, that actually if you perform functional MRI, the component of the brain that is responsible for memory is markedly underactive compared to those that aren't as active with social media. So how do, as we talked about education, you kind of touched upon that, Dr. Hashimoto, in your excellent presentation. How do we leverage technology to avoid de-skilling and augment education when the technology itself leads to de-skilling? That's kind of it's a catch-22. So your comments on that specifically. And then secondly, for the panel, the governance question is really tricky, and it is the wild, wild west. So at the University of Kentucky, we've gone in the direction of centralization at the campus level. So our 17 colleges report up to what's called CATS AI. Of course, they have to have a Kentucky mnemonic, but that, it basically makes it it centralizes resources, but at the unit level or even the college level, it makes it very difficult to know who to turn to explore technology, to try to get approval. And a good example is the technology that will allow you to record a laparoscopic operation, do your operative report, and it leads to 30% upcoding. So just last week, I met with the health systems director of finance and said, hey, this could lead to a 30% uptick in revenue. And immediately we had an audience. So I don't know, how do we, the governance is very tricky. It is really crazy. We don't really know who to turn to when we're looking to embrace technology. And some technology is going to work, some's going to fail. But just the panel's view on governance so that we can get this right. And we actually, as surgeons who are active in this space, can lead and provide the leadership to provide an ethical, responsible governance to the AI rollout. Thank you very much.
So I'll speak a little bit about the question of governance because actually it's an excellent question, Dr. Nabnett, and it's something that we've actually been struggling with in our surgical intelligence program in our Department of Surgery, which is a young program that we'd only established over the past year. And one of our biggest initiatives right now is that we've been working to develop an operative data warehouse where we provide de-identified data into this data silo that will be part of this multimodal data infrastructure that Mount Sinai already has called ARMS. And in order to do that, we've been really struggling with this idea of who owns the laparoscopic robotic data. Do we have to get surgeons' permission to be able to capture the data, de-identify it, and use it? Can we somehow affix identifiers to the operative data so that we can have some outcome data for the future to establish whether or not there were some complications that may have developed from this or that, or how did the patients do based on this operative video, et cetera. So to the long story short, we don't really have answers for that yet. The question about governance of AI and responsible use of it is something that I think is still very much evolving, and it requires a lot of panels like this and input from other surgeons and other important key players to establish this idea of ownership. We also have struggled with the idea of what patients should know about and how we get patient permission for this as well. If the videos won't all be completely de-identified, or if there'll be a short period where we follow their outcomes, then de-link the identifiers to it. So these are all really important questions, and I think that what we've come to conclude at this time is that we've surveyed a lot of people who've already been trying to develop these operative data warehouses to see what they've actually been doing, and we've had a lot of different answers. And I think that this is a very much evolving conversation that requires, on some level, some, of course, institutional feedback, discussion with ethics committees, discussion with what we have is called the Mount Sinai Innovation Partners, where they look at all of our kind of agreements and data use plans, and they give us oversight on that. So I think that's a challenging discussion, and I think that's something that we have to continue to figure out together collectively.
I mean, I think, well, I'll start with the governance one to stay on topic, and then I can answer a little bit about the de-skilling point, which would be an opinion only, of course. It's great to have a surgeon in the ACMIO role, right? Because so many times it's hard to have a surgeon in that type of a role. One, there are not that many surgeon informaticists. Two, health systems like to see surgeons in the operating, generating revenue, right? And so I think it's tough, but it is so necessary because there are idiosyncrasies, as we all know, to being in the operating room and to having a surgical workflow that is very difficult to communicate, whether through a Zoom meeting, whether through a survey or what have you. And having that level of advocacy in the C-suite at the governance level there is so critical, because if you don't have that representation, a lot of things, not maliciously, but just out of the lack of sort of insight, understanding, representation, however you want to call it, just get missed, right? Because it's a different set of expertise than what is typically represented on those governance panels. So, that saying that if you've seen one academic medical center, you've seen one academic medical center. So everybody's governance platform is or architecture is very different. But I would argue that all of you at your different institutions should argue for surgical representation in those governance frameworks, whatever they may look like. On the de-skilling piece, it is interesting. Probably the best data that we have is from gastroenterology, right? So they have computer-assisted diagnosis in gastroenterology. And some of the initial studies show that when you launch that, young gastroenterologists who have not had a chance to really build up their clinical skills, when they get it and it gets taken away, their adenoma detection rate drops below acceptable thresholds. And they have to rebuild that skill to have an adequate ADR for polyps when they're doing colonoscopies. And so we see immediately, right, there's a clear de-skilling effect that comes into play when it is incorporated early into somebody's training. But then the question is, well, do you just take it away and force people to not have it? I think it's also the same question that came up, right, with that transition to lap chole versus open chole, now robotic chole with lap chole, open chole. There's always these new technologies that come into play, and while there needs to be some base of like understanding different principles about how we're going to do certain things, at some point it's not like we're going to say, well, you can't learn how to use a stapler until you learn how to hand sew all your bowel anastomoses first. Right, so we have to figure out where that balance is, and I think it's going to be task specific. I don't think we'll be able to make sort of blanket recommendations around that.
Yeah, no, great points. And I can't advocate more to your statement about having, someone in the C-suite that's in the trenches with you every day. Classic example from our own home institution, we're recently moving towards getting rid of pagers, right? And, that works great unless you have your hands in a sterile glove and your face behind a mask, and you can't have your phone unlocked when you're scrubbed in and you're taking calls and consults. And that hit the radar nowhere until, finally it came across our desk, and we're like, okay, great, but what's our contingency plan for the operating room when you can't face unlock the phone to answer that secure chat or chat message, or put your finger on to unlock your phone and de-identify, and you have a bring your own device policy at the institution. So then you're opening up the entire personal universe to an anonymous third party that might be there for one day in the OR with you. So you do need that, and I justify it by my time. I can do one operation and generate some RVUs, or I can help 100 of my partners be more efficient and generate hundreds of more RVUs with that little bit of buyout of my time. But absolutely. We had another question.
Actually, can I make a quick comment
yes.
about Barry's question? So I went to this great AI talk recently, and the person was actually a lawyer, and he was talking about ethical AI. And so he had categorized AI in healthcare into like 3 broad buckets, which is like, what are we doing with it that's like really good right now, which is like automating drudgery, right? Like that's like the scribing and whatnot and writing the prior auth, although that has its own problem too, because we're basically like cementing a dysfunctional system, right? And now it's like bots against bots. And then the 2 that are harder are improve human performance and democratize care, right? And so to Barry's question about de-skilling, it really comes down to like, what is the context, right? And so like, if it is AI versus an expert surgeon, right, and then that surgeon's performance is going to decrease over time, that's really problematic. But if it's AI versus nothing, that might be okay, right? Then there are some ethical implications there, but that might be okay if the alternative is nothing.
Excellent points. Yes, from the left.
So thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Jason Prescott from NYU. I'm glad to hear that there was an attorney involved in what you were discussing, because I'm curious to know what your relationships are relative to the technology that you're building and your legal departments. Because I anticipate that you are sending over this component of your work to an AI, yet you're still responsible for what the output is. And if any of you have ever reviewed legal cases before, you know that what goes into all those records and what happens is scrutinized very carefully. So I'm curious to know, what is your relationship with your legal departments? How are they involved in the development and sort of implementation of this technology in such a way that your institution is protected and you're protected, but still able to roll out this technology?
Well, so we, some of you may have this in your ORs, but we had partnered with Surgical Safety Technology about 3 to 4 years ago to bring black boxes into our ORs. So we have 19 of them in our ORs, and there was it was a huge effort from from leadership in the Department of Surgery to be able to do this. And to Dr. Prescott's point, there was a lot of discussion with the legal teams about how this data would be used, what of it would be discoverable, would it be utilized for any punitive action, because one of the components of Black Box, for those who haven't used it, is that they have this this ability to capture everything in the room with cameras. So you can see, what had happened, why was there an error in this, what was this, why was like the wrong side like operated on, et cetera, like why was this administered this medication incorrectly. They can kind of capture some of these details. And so there was a lot of concern from different players in the OR about how this data and this information might be used against them. So all that to say is that I think it's almost on a case-by-case basis that things have to be discussed with the legal team. We have a robust legal team that oversees any of our, of course, like any institution, any of our data use agreements. So for a lot of, on the research realm, when we are developing these models to perform any of these kind of tasks, these clinical tasks or whatnot that we have for our research questions, if we're trying to acquire like external data or transfer data out, we of course have to have robust data use agreements. The other question about things are, these models that we're using. I'm sure we all know that we shouldn't be putting like PHI into ChatGPT because that's data that they're going to use for training their own models. So on an enterprise level, we have access to GPT-5, so some of the larger models, because we have the computational infrastructure to allow for that. But also within our research realm, what I've been doing, what many of us have been doing, are using open source large language models that can be run behind our own institutional firewalls so that we're able to input PHI into it, run models, and then perform different like clinical tasks that we're attempting to do.
Yeah, I think I have an email almost every week with Office of General Counsel for the different things that we do. For us, for our video stuff at least, our teams build all that from scratch, so we're not relying on outside companies to do that. I have a team of really bright computer science graduate students. We use University Compute, and that never leaves our little closed cloud. Now that took a lot. It took me about a year and a half to set that up when I got to Penn to make it doable. There was a lot of hand-wringing, as you can imagine, from OGC about starting to ingest some of these videos, and we had to set up de-identification pipelines that would de-risk some of that. But it's never a perfect system. Now, that being said, one of my earliest projects when I was still at MGH was funded by Crico, the malpractice carrier. And they were like, this is great, because if you have a video, we can settle. We'll save money if we have a video, actually, which is a different approach than some. I've been to some institutions that are like, we have zero video recording capability because we don't want anybody to have that option. So every institution takes a different approach and has a different level of tolerance, I think, for that kind of risk.
Yeah, I'll just make a few comments on that, and then we'll take one from the center aisle here. Yeah, I think legal at our institution is heavily involved, and either day-to-day operations and then on individual use cases, as you pointed out. But classic point of example would be with the use of ambient listening technologies, not only clinically but also academically. Right? I've had a few instances where persons were recorded on Zoom meetings or Teams meetings without necessarily their knowledge or express consent. Now it's a pop-up, thankfully, in the software. It has iterated over time to show you that, but no harm intended in that. They were just using it to summarize meetings and such. But even if you're in a one or a two-party state, our legal felt that it was necessary to get verbal consent from all patients for every encounter. It's embedded within the note as a dot phrase that you have to fill out. So I think those are all considerations that need to be weighed in when you're having any form of extrinsic listening. But center aisle, yes.
Thank you. Abby Fingerett, University of Nebraska. No disclosures. One disclaimer. I am a utilizer of ambient listening software, and that is probably the extent of my AI interaction. So we've heard a lot about how surgeons can use AI to better their workflow and to help their patients. I have, say, a contrary and conflicting perspective where the patients come to me with what ChatGPT has told them is the operation I should be offering them. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what is our role and responsibility, both as individual surgeons and as a society, on educating our patients about the limitations of these resources and the appropriate use of them? Thank you.
I had my first what I call self-referral from a robot the other day. they'd gone to see one of my partners who would offer them an open operation, and then they canceled the operation. And when I met the patient was like, well, I asked ChatGPT, and they said I should have a robotic surgery, and they pointed me to you. But no, I mean, it is happening more and more often, right? It's very similar to how they used to go to WebMD or what have you. And it is a discussion I have. I try to spend too much time on it, right? But I tell them, half jokingly, I'm like, oh, I'm so glad. Let me know how that operation goes when ChatGPT does it for you. And then they're kind of like, oh, okay, like, yeah, it's not actually going to do the operation for me, so I have to rely on what your judgment, experience, et cetera, is. But I think to a point, it's hard to get into the specifics of like, well, it's trained this way or that way. I think it's just to say, that's all great. I'm glad you have been empowered to educate yourself about this disease process, and I'm glad you have these tools available. You're here to see me to hear about my experience doing this operation or managing this condition for multiple other patients, which this technology does not do. Here's what my opinion is, and here's what I recommend X, Y, Z. And actually, oftentimes, if you prompt that back into the model, it'll agree, because they're sycophantic,
Yeah.
most of these models, so they'll just agree with you. And so you're like, great, look, ChatGPT backs up exactly what I said too.
Yeah, I think your job at that point is to say like, okay, yeah, this is like what the general patient is recommended to do, but like my job is to interpret this for you and make sure that my recommendation is as personalized as possible.
I will say I'm guilty of doing that exact same thing. So a lot of times I can't figure out what's going on with my kids when they're sick. And I asked ChatGPT, I was like, what is this like viral exanthem? And so I'm very guilty of that too, so I don't have to talk to my pediatrician. So from that personal experience, I will say that certainly, and of course, we've all now had patients tell us that they've spoken to ChatGPT before coming to speak to us. But I of course, agree with Dr. Singh and Dr. Hashimoto on their thoughts about how to kind of accommodate those questions to patients in a way that doesn't necessarily disparage them from using these technologies, since it's pretty ubiquitous now. We all use it. But my only other thought about that is that, the things that we have to think about with how AI can be used for patient care in this realm is not necessarily just asking ChatGPT to spit out what they think should be done, because we know that they're just trained on lots and lots and lots of like language data, so they know what's out there in the World Wide Web. They just summarize it well, and they're able to speak with great authority and sound very convincing. But I think we can also consider how AI can be used in the future as more like clinical decision support tools to help us to better make decisions for patients based on clinical data, to help us better synthesize it, to better kind of understand and like be able to quickly extract like clinical guidelines in ways that are very efficient. And these models that are being developed, I think, are still nascent, and that's why we don't see them deployed, in Epic and EHR right now. And I think that that's where we kind of are when we're thinking about AI and how it's used in medicine. I think of it as, again, being able to support us in helping to make diagnostic like interpretations and ultimate clinical decisions.
Absolutely. Just an interesting thought, perhaps marrying the last two questions together about legal and the use of these, right? We saw a flurry of lawsuits about missed inbox messages, abnormal results on, auto-verified, the, CAT scan looks good, click done, get it out of your inbox. What are your thoughts about the future potential litigation for not using the AI technologies and perhaps missing a diagnosis or missing a confounding variable that changes practice? What are your thoughts on that?
I think like these models can be configured in multiple ways, right? It's all a matter of thresholds and what risk you're willing to tolerate, right? Like you can configure it with a different threshold for like what is an acceptable negative predictive value versus like a positive predictive value. And I think that might actually get down to like surgeon by surgeon, institution by institution, right? Because inherently that's what we do right now, right? Like we have a different tolerance for risk for each of our patients.
Absolutely. Center right.
Hi, try again. Can you guys hear me okay? All right.
Yep.
Matthew DeYoung from Loyola University. My question is kind of in relation to the patient-surgeon relationship. As we've kind of all discussed, AI is coming into the medical field. And I think for me, I've experienced times in clinical settings when patients kind of in a sarcastic way ask, is this, what you're thinking, or is this from what AI is saying? And I guess my question is in relation to how we as physicians and clinicians help just kind of broach that transparency of the use of AI to help it strengthen our relationship with our patients rather than kind of get in between that. So what are strategies that you guys think that we should start, I guess, adopting as surgeons in terms of transparency and use with AI?
I think it's, and we have actually a piece coming out in surgical endoscopy about this. It is, I think, very important to disclose your use of AI when you're using it to support decisions. Now, we don't do that currently if we're doing the risk if we think about risk calculators and things like that. But if you are relying heavily on, and some of these technologies may or may not even exist, right? But you think about hypothetical situations like this go, no-go zone thing that I showed in Lap Chole to tell patients, very similar to how we consent them for ambient, to say, hey, is it okay if I record this encounter so that I can pay more attention to you during the visit and it's going to do some documentation summarization. I think it's very similar as these tools become more commercially available for implementation in the operating room, patients may have very strong feelings about having their data incorporated into some of these models. And to be very transparent about whether you plan to use something like that. And then, because then the question becomes, if you use that model without the patient's consent, and then you make a mistake, now what, right? And I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer that question, but that becomes a very thorny issue. And will that become part of our consent process in certain procedures? Certainly for procedural AI, I think it probably should. I think a patient was telling me the other day there was something about I haven't seen this episode yet, but in the pit, I guess they're using ambient or something like that, and something happened. Because this patient was like, I don't want you to use that. I saw this episode of the pit. Don't use the app. So I thought that was very interesting. I was like, oh, I haven't seen that episode. I better go watch it. It is we know that medical media, right, influences the way that patients perceive healthcare and their healthcare interactions. And so I'm curious as to how this is all going to evolve over the next year or two as it enters sort of that mainstream consciousness more.
I have a question. It sounds like most of the panelists here are using the various models to get information into the system. Is anyone utilizing it to take information out? We found some of our best return on investment on implementing tools like assisted patient communication letters, draft summaries of hospital courses, which save interns countless hours and oftentimes turn out a better product than the patient was admitted for 3 years and was discharged home in status condition after having 6 operations, and that was the discharge summary, right? So are any of you utilizing it more as an output generation or ambulatory listening to generate your orders in a queue for you when you go back, and that way you don't have to remember all the things you said you were going to do because it's right there in the shopping cart to drop?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of my practice is from private practice endocrinologists. So typically all my clinical data actually still comes in through PDFs, and you're going to get a 50-page PDF with totally irrelevant labs, and you don't want to read through that. And so there are actually some really great HIPAA-compliant chatbots that will highlight specific sections and summarize sections. So the summary power of these large language models is excellent. So that's really helpful. Another way where I've found is really helpful is if I need to translate a document for post-operative care for a language that we don't routinely encounter. I mean, it's not 100%, but it's 90%, right? That patient is going to get the gist of what they need to do.
We've been using, and we recently developed a project in our department also a sort of QI project where we're using LLMs to be able to better identify surgical complications from the EHR. So our workflow previously was that, residents remember the complications, they submit it, and then, at the end of the year, you're like, oh, we've only had 5 colon leaks, this whole year. And so there's obviously this loss in fidelity of capture of surgical complications when you depend on actual like, human recall. So we've developed like this method working with our digital technology partners to be able to identify all the surgeons, extract and summarize the like surgical cases, and then the LLMs are able to go through and look at the EHR and identify what complications there are, and also summarize the complication. And so this is sort of a project that's ongoing as we're sort of improving on this, and that's done from our QI program.
Wonderful. All right, we'll go center left and then right.
Thank you so much. I'll switch the gears a little bit. What about efficiency inside the operating room? How can we make sure that surgeons are involved in sort of the AI models that are supposed to improve efficiency inside the operating room? Because we don't use it in our operating room right now, like lean TOS or some of these things. But from sort of a query of the people who use it, it seems like the percentage improvements are very small, and it's a bit of garbage in, garbage out right now. So how can surgeons help improve that?
I think some of that is giving that right context, right? And you're right. I think like a lot of the gains are pretty marginal. And at the end of the day, if you're saving 2 minutes of the operating time, you're not getting another case in there. So like, how much does that really matter? Because it's not going to change your revenue equation. One of the questions is like sort of thinking about the downside of measuring those types of efficiencies when you think about, you know, identifying a surgeon that, why does it take them twice as long to close relative to that surgeon? Oh, they're teaching the medical student. And is that something that we want to give up for the sake of generating an extra 4 RVUs because you can fit something else in there, right? And I think, again, it's that representation piece about like sort of who's at the table to represent those types of interests, particularly if you're at an academic institution, to think about how those are going to come into play.
I can just speak to how we're sort of adopting or trying to figure this out in our own surgical intelligence program. Again, this kind of young program. We're working on trying, well, first of all, we've already submitted a survey to all the surgeons in our department to ask them what is important to them in terms of what sort of industry partnerships could we pursue or seek out that would identify important tools that may be useful. There are, of course, already developed products that are out there that they would love to work in a hospital setting and kind of trial out their technology. And then, of course, there are the homegrown tools that are a lot slower to develop and adopt because you have to have the right kind of team in-house to be able to develop it. So to accelerate the usage of like these AI tools, again, that are rapidly changing and rapidly evolving a lot faster than we can develop them ourselves, we've sought out these partnerships. And I think that it's a good point. You have to think about what sort of use case do you want it for. We've been looking at a partnership with an industry collaborator that they generate the operative reports for us, and their whole ROI is that they're going to improve our billing, where they're going to be able to capture in their automated operative reports some like billable codes that we otherwise would have missed if we just kind of use the same code every time for like a lap chole. So those are some of the things that we're pursuing, but it's a really excellent question because we also are thinking that the sky's the limit. We could think about anything that bothers us about AI, or that bothers us about our clinical workflows that are inefficient, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to kind of pursue an AI tool for everything.
I want to follow up on that, is that when you are in the process of evaluating an AI tool, especially for something for efficiency, I think it's really important to think about the underlying care design, because what we don't want to do is cement some sort of dysfunction or cement some sort of inefficiency into the program. And so really it's like if your OR turnover time is an hour and a half, right? Like putting in an OR intelligence tool that will optimize block scheduling for you is not going to improve the underlying dysfunction. So you really need to take it as an opportunity for care redesign.
Absolutely, absolutely. To the right.
Quang Du from San Francisco. This is a wonderful, wonderful panel. I want to ask a question that's a little bit sort of outside of what we're talking about right now regarding patient care and all that. And I want to bring it back to our own meeting, which is academic, which is trying to learn about new things and all that. So it's related to creativity and disclosure. So in our meetings right now, we actually don't know much about the disclosure part of it. As it turns out, if you look at it, the check of use of AI comes at the end. When you submit your paper to surgery, they ask you, did you use AI? How did you use it? What are the things? And there are certain things that are obviously prohibited. If you use your, I don't know, spelling checker, that's almost expected. In fact, if you don't use it, that's probably bad. But, but if you use AI to generate your whole manuscript, that's obviously prohibited. But in some way, we need this technology to help us do better. And anyway, I'm just wondering what the panelists have any thoughts about how we use AI in our own meeting. How do we, maybe somebody generated a great idea using AI, and then they pursued it, and that's great. That's very creative, etc. But maybe somebody just went to ChatGPT and says, I want to get on the podium for AAES, and maybe I should put that in and see what we can do. So do you have any thoughts about that?
I can start. So I feel like, again, one of the real strengths of AI is basically summaries, right? And so whenever you start a research project, you have to go and look at, well, what has already been published in this area and what are the gaps? And I think it's totally legitimate to use AI to summarize the published literature. You still have to do a little bit of checking and make sure that all the references are legitimate, but then it actually gives you some great ideas in terms of identifying the gaps. So that's one area where I feel like it's a no-brainer for AI. The other area where I feel like it's pretty legitimate to use AI is for just really simple proofreading and grammar, or reformatting maybe for a specific journal, right? That's not really any value add. That's just the journal having their weird specifications of how they want the sections to be arranged, right? That's not anything that requires any creativity or imagination to do, right? So those are probably the two areas where I feel like the AI is actually very appropriate and good.
I definitely agree with that. Having handled manuscripts where there's egregious. I've seen one where it's clear all the letters are misspelled on the figures and things like that. Obviously, that's a no-go. The review, that's I think what I find very interesting. I'm very opposed to sort of using LLMs to help you write a review or to do the first passive review for you. So I can tell you from the engineering meetings that I've reviewed for, they actually have a process. They will hide prompts into the submitted manuscript so that when a reviewer copies and pastes that into a large language model, there are instructions in the output of the review that are hidden. But obviously, these are engineers, they know how to find them out. And so we have disqualified multiple reviewers because we have found that they have used large language models to write their review. I have not been part of any surgical journals that have done that yet, but I have certainly seen reviews come back where it's clear that a large language model was used. And at that point, it's what's the point, right? If you're just going to have an LLM review this, is that really what you really want to evaluate the quality of science? Now, there's things, I know New England Journal of Medicine AI, for example, has an LLM tool that you can submit your paper to that will do a pre-review. That's actually meant as constructive feedback, which I find very interesting, which is that it'll give the authors feedback to say, here's why we don't think that you will pass our screening, and here are ways that you can improve your manuscript. Please don't submit this to us just yet, right? Actually, that's kind of constructive in some way, but it's not the final check of is this rigorous science that's reproducible, et cetera. For those types of things, I think it's very much that Jurassic Park type question. We're so busy asking ourselves, can we, that we never asked ourselves, should we? And that's where we really have to land. It's should, to your point, I think Dr. Lee was saying earlier, should we be using AI to do X, Y, Z sort of thing?
That's a good question. When I think about it a lot with this philosophical idea about how we can use generative AI, which is supposed to help to generate things, the whole spectrum of academia, there's this question, of course, about almost plagiarism. Is this really your idea, or is it something that's generated by an AI tool? I think that on a more eagle's eye view, I think generative AI can be very useful for certain tasks that have already been discussed, for summarization, with organization, and things like that. They can also be really helpful with kind of making you think about ideas that you didn't necessarily know about. But I think obviously the actual intensity of the work has to obviously be homegrown. I think that increasingly there are more, like Dr. Hashimoto was saying, checks on things like using AI for the review process. I was on an NIH study section panel like recently, and they clearly said none of this can be used in AI. Like, you cannot use an AI tool. These are people's individual grants, so you can't copy and paste parts of it into like an AI tool. So there are those sort of frameworks, I think, that are prohibiting and already being recognized as things that should be prohibited. But I mean, now I use it to certainly help me with like maybe just clarifying like parts of a manuscript to make it more readable. And I think that those are acceptable use cases, but it's a spectrum, I believe.
Because I can see the day that when we submit our abstract to AAES, we will go through some AI process that will streamline certain things and may, in the process, miss some very original stuff. And but anyway, I think that's a lot of that stuff is coming. And also the fact that most journals right now prohibits reviewers from using AI. I think in the long term, that's just not going to be sustainable.
Great. From the right.
Hi, Zach Whaley. I'm one of the residents at Cornell. So I'm a big fan of kind of a lot of the transitions that AI has helped with. I use it very regularly for a lot of administrative tasks that have cut down significantly on a lot of routine, just manual, mindless labor that I have to do. I do get concerned about potentially, not necessarily misuse, but a unfortunate use of AI, especially that's integrated into our healthcare systems, as maybe not an example of AI, but like sepsis trigger warnings that happen. That's, again, not really AI, but one of the hospitals we rotate at has their sepsis trigger warnings on like a hair trigger. So if the patient works with PT within the past 30 minutes, they're gonna trigger a sepsis warning. And so, with a lot of hospitals being obviously very risk averse, especially, some smaller hospitals, do you foresee a circumstance, and do you have any thoughts about how to maybe mitigate just the EMR maybe over-generating and having a higher sensitivity but lower specificity and making these warnings and then passing that on to us, where then we're just having to deal with actually looking up and seeing whether or not it has any validity in the warning that it's producing?
Yeah, I feel like alert fatigue is really real, and it kind of goes back to that original comment about like we need to decide at an individual institution level, like whether that threshold can be set, right? Like I think you're probably referring to like the EPIC sepsis score and how it's been rolled out and it hasn't really generalized well at many institutions, right? And that's kind of like the sort of fine-tuning piece that a lot of people forget about. Like when you deploy these models, it's not like, okay, we're done, right? Like these models have to be fine-tuned continuously at some regular cadence, right? Because there's also data drift over time, like, right? Your patient population could change over time. And so we really need to think about this as a dynamic process and not a one-and-done process.
I think that's also this idea of this digital value creation. It's like, where do you realize the gains in value? Is the gain in making sure that you don't miss any sepsis worth the loss of your productive time as a clinician, and then multiply that times the number of people getting these sepsis flags? That's going to alter your productivity, increase your burnout rate, et cetera, et cetera. So there are costs to this, right? But to Dr. Zhang's point, tuning that to the individual institution's risk tolerance is challenging.
100%. I just gave a talk earlier this week, and to your point, the deployment, which many people take as the completion of their project, is only step 3 of a 5-step process. You have to monitor the output and then go back to step 1 and start over again. And I think that's the key to this, is if you lose those 4th and 5th steps, you're going to end up with 90% dismiss and override, which is where we were when we moved off of one EMR to a second EMR. 90 to 95% of all warnings were just ignored and proceed. From the right.
Rohit from New York. Great panel, great talk earlier as well. Question about these language models or chatbots that we use. They constantly learn your personality. That's what I have noticed over the last 6 months. To kind of piggyback on Dr. Kwandu's question, should it not be considered a part of our extended brain And should it not have the use of AI for creativity, I think it should be considered legal that way because it learns our personality, it's constantly getting better. And so as to say, it's augmenting our IQ as well. That is the first question. Second question is in terms of, in the era of standardized medicine, we all are doing things to get things the right way for improving outcomes. So the question of judgment call that we as physicians use, will that be usurped? And the question is, will we all lose our autonomy there in making decisions?
So there's a quote, I think it was a former dean at Hopkins, right, who used to say, I think, that technology is there to get the unnecessary variation out of care, but humans are there to keep the necessary variation in, right? And I think that goes back to, I think that I was talking about it in the last hour, just there are decisions to be made about that person in front of you, and the way that these large language models are currently constructed, like autoregressive models, at the end of the day, are very good statistical machines, but they don't encode knowledge per se. And so it is, I think, a stretch to really consider them sort of an extension of your brain in that way, because while they're very good at statistical association and sort of vectorization around concepts and topics, they're not inherently knowing any of these things, right? And so if we think about, there's a quote that I actually heard last week, I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so I can focus on my art and poetry, and yet here we have AI doing art and poetry, and we're doing laundry and dishes like never before. And so again, what are the things that we want to outsource to these models that would allow us to better fulfill our lives as human beings? And these are choices. And right now, the choices that are being offered to us as a constraint of the design of the current models and sort of some of the market forces around throw more money at this problem. It will get smarter in the sense that it's better able to answer questions, but it is not inherently changing the underlying function of these AI tools. And there are constraints around what it can do, and there are limits that we're going to hit when we run out of money. Or energy or water, or however you want to consider what drives these models. And so in some ways, I think we've very much, from the engineering side of things, been distracted from actually searching for more efficient, optimal tools to give us better artificial intelligence. But that is sort of a whole other discussion, too.
I think AI is something, Dr. Hashimoto already said this in his talk, but AI is something that really augments the human being. It augments us as clinicians. It certainly won't replace us. And there's a real, of course, danger about allowing AI to sort of autonomously make decisions for us in the clinical realm. We're certainly not there yet, and hopefully we never will be, because like Dr. Hashimoto said, these large language models, they're just really good prediction models. They're trained on large corpuses of data, that's language, and they're very good at being able to essentially predict next words and next sentences and phrases based on the training data. So there's no inherent knowledge that they're giving us. They're just basically very, very good at predicting, based on patterns of the data that they recognize, what should be the next response. So there's nothing really mysterious or really very, very original, I would say, other than just being mathematical in essence. So with that idea of like what they're actually doing, right, absolutely, I don't think that they should ever really be considered something that will replace us. I think where they can certainly shine is in terms of like responsible training, and also being able to be an AI assist for maybe clinicians or practitioners who don't have more domain-specific expertise, or in locations where there's a lack of specialists who are capable of like really recognizing, okay, this looks like a TIRADS 5 nodule versus like a 2 nodule, things like that, where there's like this variability in interpretation. That's where AI can really help to standardize and enhance capabilities of the training of clinicians.
I totally agree. I feel like at least with the current tools we have, we're never going to get to a point where like the large language model 100% is never going to hallucinate and we're going to be able to completely remove the human out of the loop. And I would say that like even the chatbots right now for clinical questions, some of the companies are now recognizing that and moving towards either still having a human in the loop, so that you would actually still have hopefully an expert review this question before it is disseminated back out as an output.
All right, excellent. Well, we're down to the last couple seconds, so I think to stay on track, we'll need to adjourn here, but I do see there's at least one question. If you guys have a few spare minutes after, we'll hang around and answer questions on a one-on-one basis, but thank you, everyone, and thanks you for the opportunity for us all to be here today.
Thank you.